Thank you very much, Professor Franke. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome also from my side. I have the honor and privilege to use the next 15 minutes to try to give a definition what green and sustainable finance is, and that's not going to be an easy task. In the preparation of this speech, I have a little bit come to the conclusion that green finance is, in some aspects, like pornography. About which the famous US Supreme Court Justice Porter Stewart once said, when asked for a definition what it is, I know it when I see it. And I'll try to explain a little bit what I mean by this, and we could please move 2 slides ahead. The issue with the definition of green finance is that there is no common definition, and with different agents and different motivations, we see a various scope how green finance is being defined. On top of that, green finance is just one of a number of terms which are being used to label the broader area of finance to aim and to protect the environment. And we have heard already some of these terms being used by the governor and by Mr. Jersenbeck, such things as sustainable finance. Now, if we can move 1 slide ahead, please. I'd like to try to give an overview of how different actors actually shape the discussion on what green finance is. And I do believe we need to start with the wider policy context and to start with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreements, which have already been mentioned before, because they are the landmarks of the commitment of the international community to move to a more sustainable society and a climate neutral economy. And we have heard we need a lot of technology, different capabilities, a change maybe also in consumption patterns to reach those goals, but also a tremendous amount of financial resources will need to be mobilized in order to make this shift and this transition happening. So several initiatives have been drawn up, how to move the flow of money towards these goals. The UN bodies have been leading. And so we have seen the emergence of several guidelines and principles to investors and bankers, how to increase the impact of their activities towards SDG and how to provide frameworks, for instance, for a sustainable banking system. On the other hand, in parallel and maybe even preceding, we have seen industry-originated frameworks having maybe their roots even in the 70s in the civil rights movements, in the environmental movements. And we have heard it from the governor, ESG agendas are more and more at the core of many companies, and they provide a huge catalyst for ESG investment. And I'd like to point out the United Nations facilitated principles for responsible investment here. At some estimates, more than half of the total global institutional assets currently under management are managed by institutions which are formally embracing these principles, which is a huge commitment of the financial markets towards ESG criteria within investment decisions. And then we have a third area, which also has been touched upon, especially by the governor, which is labeling standards and taxonomies. I think the most important labeling standard is probably the green bond standard or the green bond principles put forward by the International Capital Market Association in 2014. It's under this standard or under this label, we have seen double-digit growth in green bonds, reaching a level of $260 billion in 2019. However, it is believed that this only captures half of the market of bonds actually eligible under these label, as a lot of issuers do not bother to go through the process of labeling. So it's not really a good measure to see how much of a transition we are doing or having right now, and also the governor related to the greenwashing risk already. On the other hand, we can see the rise and the emergence of taxonomies. We see initiatives in UK, in China, in Canada, but foremost in the EU. And I'm going to talk more about the EU taxonomy later. I do not believe that we can overstate the importance of this taxonomy in terms of discussing what green finance is. And with the next slide, I would like then to try to give a definition of green finance. And I do believe we need to answer two questions in order to come up with a workable definition. First, what is green? And I'd like to propose that this is given by the environmental part of the sustainability development goals. And the second is, how can greenness be achieved? And I do believe that we will see taxonomies driving the answer to that second question. And to me then, green finance is financing to support activities and sectors that contribute to the achievement or improvement in one of the relevant green goals. Now I'd like to spend the rest of my talk about with seeing how this is actually happening and working in Europe. And for that, please go to the next slide. It's already been mentioned by my speakers before me that the EU has embarked on a Green Deal. We want to move to climate neutrality by 2050. And an action plan has been put forward in 2018 with the aim to reorient capital flows towards more sustainable investments. We have seen the establishment of the EU Sustainable Finance Framework, which contains a lot of different pieces. The taxonomy I've already mentioned, but certain directives, a green bond standard, an EU eco label, and much more. In July, we have seen an update of this strategy, and especially a concern of the EU is that there needs to be more progress in the banking and insurance sectors. The identification and management of sustainable risk by banks and insurers are key for the EU's economic resilience and financial stability. And finding progress to be insufficient, the Commission proposes legislative changes to prudential frameworks, and we will see ESG factors included in risk management systems and supervision to a much greater extent than in the past. We will see exercises on climate change stress testing. We will see changes in capital requirement rules, amendments to Solvency II for insurance companies. We will see greater attention on disclosure, and EIOPA will also be asked to assess changes on which might be necessary for fiduciary duties of pension funds and investors to reflect sustainable impacts. Also, the EU is pushing for much more international cooperation and alignment. I think that's very important, especially on the front of the IFRS. There is a push to reflect sustainable risk in financial reporting standards. And lastly, the EU will work on strengthening the EU taxonomy. And if we go to the next slide, we can see already that EBA and the ECB, and the governor already mentioned most of these actions, have put forward concrete action plans on how to accelerate that shift towards a more sustainable finance. Notably, I think that from the EBA, the most important initiatives are currently on the disclosure of ESG-related risks. And on the other hand, the inclusion of ESG risk and risk management and SREP. In June this year, we have seen a report by EBA, and this clearly steers supervisory expectations and already hinted that there will be future guidelines on this topic. And I do believe this will move from a voluntary exercise to a much more strict regulated undertaking. On the ECB action plan, the governor already pointed out most of the activities here. For me, most interesting is the acceleration of the development of new modules to monitor the implications of climate change. Of course, those new modules will need data. So we will see more exercises, I believe, in the EU on statistical data, which will feed those modules. And of course, this will affect the audience here. And already next year, we will see new climate stress tests being conducted by the ECB. And I think that's going to be an interesting learning experience and learning journey for all parties involved, as we see that the methodology behind that will be improving over time. I'd like to talk about in the next slide the taxonomy a little bit, because I think the taxonomy is really at the core of what the EU is driving here. This will be used as a basis for directing capital flows to encourage investment in financial products that are deemed to be environmentally sustainable. This will probably also be determined to assess risks, environmental risks of certain assets, and maybe also form the basis of bank capital requirements that are linked to environmentally beneficial assets. And we will see the NFRD and CSRD really heavily relying on this taxonomy, and this will be the basis that I believe by 2023, all larger EU corporations, so basically everybody with more than 20 million euro balance sheet, will need to report how aligned their economic activities are with this taxonomy, how green these undertakings are. And that data then will be used by other market participants to determine the greenness of assets. This will also be then used to drive disclosure, and we will see a strengthening of the CSRD. Eventually, this taxonomy will probably be used to determine green asset ratios by banks and KPIs on several banking operations. Now, with this transition to a much more concrete and regulatory-driven definition of what green finance is, there are risks emerging. And I'd like to say a couple of words on the last slides regarding these risks. And the governor has already addressed the risks of greenwashing, but I do believe that probably, in my opinion, there we are. In my opinion, two things for me are the most worrying. We will see an increase in the cost of equity and debt for non-sustainable industries. And we will see financial losses for non-sustainable industries. And the question will be, how are these costs being spread? Who's bearing those costs? And how smooth and predictable the transition will be? And the second thing I'm worried about is that we see the EU very much at the forefront of setting standards at this point in time. And the question is, how big will differences be between different jurisdictions and labels and standards? And what this will mean for the overall capital allocation. We have already talked about arbitrage. And I'll be very much looking forward for the coming up discussion on those topics. Thank you very much for your attention.